Good evening, folks. Hope you can all hear me okay. I'm just going to give the others a couple of minutes to see if anyone else is going to join us. And I've just launched the first poll if you'd like to have a go. And just make sure everything's working okay for you and that you can see the PowerPoint slide as well. It should say session number 4 and the UK example. Okay, so just a couple of minutes, go get yourself a drink, something to write with, have a go at the poll, and then we'll get started. Hey, welcome year 11. I'm just going to give it one more minute. If you know of anyone that's trying to get in but can't get in, if they've texted you or messaged you, can you ask them just to drop me an email and I'll send a link back out? I think some people's links haven't worked. Yours obviously have, but some people's haven't. Right, okay. Good evening, year 11. I think for some reason the link on the email that was sent out earlier in the day seems to cause some problems for people. So if you can just direct people to using the links that are on Teams, I think that probably would be better, just in case anyone texts you asking. So we've just got a couple of people just joining us now. Welcome if you've just joined. Okay, so I ran a bit of a poll at the beginning just to see if you guys could hear me. And we're just going to view the results now. Interesting. Okay, so the question was, which case studies relate to paper 2, section A, question 1, urban challenges? Unfortunately, only 25% of you got Rio de Janeiro correct. There was 2 answers there, so it was Rio de Janeiro and then London. Fab. Okay, so that was section A, also known as question 1. That's how it appears in the exam. The 2 case studies you need for that are Rio and London. What we're looking at tonight, though, is our section B case studies, also known as question 2. So again, when you look at section B, all of the questions in this section are 2-point something. Last session, unfortunately, I had to postpone. I didn't think it was fair to do that to you the night before an exam, and that was on Nigeria. So that was the first of our case studies for this section, which is an economic world. And the second case study is the UK example. The question will kind of lead you towards the one that you need to look at, but it won't directly state Nigeria. Most of the time, however, it does say the UK if that's the one it wants you to use. So for me, the real key thing about all of this is just really reading the question. Hopefully that is something that you've kind of come to realise is just really vitally important. Okay, so let's crack on then with what you need to know. Okay, so question 2 in this paper, aka section B, is all about the economy of countries and then the ways in which this impacts the development of them. So the link between the two things. Last session, the pre-recorded one, which is on Teams, I focused on Nigeria as the newly emerging example, but we do also need to consider the UK's economy and what that looks like too. Partly as a comparison point, but also mainly so that you have general awareness of the UK and its history and why we are in the place that we're in. So with that in mind then, the key idea behind the question relating to the UK in this section is focusing on the changes that our economy has experienced and how these affect the functioning of the country. So, for example, in terms of where our employment sectors are, the transport and our relationships with other countries abroad. Note that the focus here on the spec is specifically on the changes in the economy and then the impact that these changes have had. So although this is geography, it's not history, but there is an element of you having to understand the background to this. And you'll notice that that's quite a common theme in all of the Twilight sessions that I've run so far. There is an element of you having to understand the context to the case study in order to be able to fully explain it. So just being mindful of that will help you set yourself up right when you're answering the questions. I'm not going to read through all of this because there is quite a bit. As you may or may not remember, this is quite a large section in general. And some of this content actually should be looking quite familiar to you. We looked at the brief history of London when we looked at section A. And what we learned there was around this idea of deindustrialisation and the traditional sort of sectors that were in and around London as a port city. But actually, this applies to many of the main cities across the UK. So please, please, please remember that what the examiner wants to see is that you can apply what you know. So try not to just compartmentalise all the theories that we learned in that first couple of case studies. You do use that to kind of help yourself explain other parts of the case studies as well. Okay, don't forget everything is what I'm trying to say. This bit here, in terms of post-industrial economy, that's a key concept. So watch out for the wording in questions because that will direct you towards what it is you need to be talking about. We're going to look at post-industrial economy, what that means, and kind of how that looks now a little bit later on in the slides. And then please do also remember that within this case study, there are specific named examples that you need to remember too. Whilst this whole section will be based around kind of your knowledge around development and the economy and the link between that, and it will expect you to talk about the UK, you need to have named examples within the UK when it comes to talking about like the rural landscape, for example. You can see in the spec there, it specifically talks about an area of population growth and an area of population decline. So it would expect you to use the named terms. And if you can remember anything from the paper 2 mock that you sat, hopefully it wasn't too traumatic, you'll remember that there was a key question on there. It was a 9 marker asking you about these two things. So please do remember that a lot of the named examples that I'm going to kind of throw in your direction tonight are things that I would really encourage you to go away and just learn a little bit, but remember that they are part of the UK case study. And that's how you get the top marks in 6 and 9 markers is by recognizing that and being able to kind of drop them in when they're needed. Okie dokie, so that's what you need to know. Let's try and move on to some of the content now. I'm going to set myself a target of, of trying to stick to the time tonight, but we'll see how we do. Okay, so changes to the UK economy. To understand where the UK is currently and why the economy matters so much, we do need to undergo a little bit of history first, so bear with me. Before the 1800s, the main source of employment in the UK was primarily in things like farming and mining, and we call these the primary sector jobs. These were essentially dealing with raw materials. That's a key term. I would write that down if you're not confident with that. Usually the primary sector jobs could be characterised by being described as labour intensive, i.e. Lots of hands on deck, long hours, manual labour, but it tended to have quite low profits and relatively low wages as well. Remember though, that this was kind of in and around the 1800s and slightly earlier. So you can see in that first pie chart there, just under the 1800s, let's see my little, there we go, this one here. 75% of the jobs in the UK in and around the 1800s and earlier were all in that primary sector. Towards the end of the 1800s, though, something had happened, and that something was the Industrial Revolution. Hopefully you've heard of that. That started and originated in central UK, which was in Birmingham, and then spread out firstly to the rest of the UK and eventually out into Europe. And the phenomenon of the introduction of machinery and the manufacturing sector changed the way that UK employment structure worked completely. So there's another little key term to be aware of, secondary sector. So that is a movement on from using raw materials, and instead now we're doing something with those materials. So if you think about it, those primary industry jobs where you've got raw materials will gain you some money. If you've got wood and you sell the wood, you will get money for it. However, if you've got wood and you can make it into something else, let's say a table, you can charge more money for the table than you can for the wood. It makes sense. And that bit's important because people started moving away from their rural settings and into towns and cities because that's where the better work opportunities were. Jobs in factories and manufacturing usually offered better wages and was slightly less labour intensive. Okay, so this is known as the secondary sector. And what you can see if we go back to our pie charts is in and around the 1900s, just after the Industrial Revolution had started, 55%, so just over half of the jobs in the UK were based in the secondary sector. Quite a large reduction there from the primary, and a slight increase in this green one, the tertiary sector. That's going to become really important in a few minutes. It was these shifts from the primary into the secondary, and then, as you can see, largely into the tertiary that helped build the British economy fairly rapidly. And along with it, the country then started to develop more politically and definitely socially. Now, when I say socially, I don't mean people going out and having lots of fun and lots of friends. Remember that social, in terms of geography, refers to the services to do with people and what people do. So housing, education, healthcare, those sorts of things. However, changes in more recent decades and then a shift of those jobs into the tertiary sector has made even more of an impact. So you can see here in the third pie chart, by 2006, 74%, so just under 2/3 of all jobs in the UK were based in the tertiary sector. Tertiary sector, remember, are less labour intensive, more skilled, better paid jobs tending to be in the service sector. So, for example, healthcare, financial industries, and also retail are just a few of those examples. Okay, so by the noughties, by the 2000s, the majority of the jobs were in that sector. One of the things that COVID really did bring to the forefront, however, was how far the UK had and has also continued to progress into the quaternary sector. Just to make things more complicated, that's the blue one. And you'll notice that one hasn't arrived until the mid 2000. Okay, that's quite important. The quaternary sector, if you remember, is all about the research and information technologies. This particular sector is important. It requires really specific skills, high levels of education, and along with it, good investments. So these types of jobs are important to the overall growth of the UK, but also to the UK being able to maintain its standards globally and worldwide. Okay, so we're going to come back to that point later on. Don't forget why it's important. But just maybe perhaps to help put things into context, the reason why getting things like the COVID jab mattered so much to the government, and why it mattered that we were one of the first countries to identify the vaccine for the COVID and to be able to roll it out, was because it was a sign to the rest of the world that we were front runners in this advanced job sector. And with that comes influence and power globally. Okay, so we are going to come back to that idea. I'm just going to launch the second of my polls. And the question is, what does deindustrialization mean? So if you can have a go at that for me just now, should have appeared up on your screen. If you can't see it, along the top, there should be a little tab that says polls. And if you click on it, you should be able to see the polls that are live currently. What does deindustrialization mean? Okay, got 5 responses so far. 7, looking good so far, 100%, well done. Any more? 10, well done. Okay, 90% are correct. Okay, I'll shift on for now and we'll come back to that idea in a few minutes. Okay, so another key term alert, folks. Since the employment sector of the UK started shifting into mainly the tertiary focus, this was in and around the mid-1980s. The country at that time began to experience a process called deindustrialisation. So I'm going to close the poll just now, and let's have a look at the, oops, let's have a look at the results. So 92% of you got that one correct, well done. Deindustrialisation, simply put, means a decline in the manufacturing industry and growth, and instead a replacement of those things with machinery, and machinery doing things for people. So a shift from kind of hard labour, manufacturing intensive type jobs into the service sector is kind of what we're talking about there. Now, we have come across this term before. When we looked at the urban unit, which is question 1, aka section A, we explored the impacts of deindustrialisation. For example, we talked specifically about London, and we talked about the dereliction of the warehouses in that inner city area. We talked about the impacts that that would have, not just on the landscape, but we also talked about the impacts it could have in terms of losing out on investments within the area and the sort of general kind of rundown feeling of an area which might push people out. But what we didn't talk about was the causes of that deindustrialisation. So here's what we need to be able to articulate in this particular section now. There are a few key reasons which we can narrow down. So that's what we're going to do just now. There are some bullet points on the board for you. Please feel free to note them down and then just kind of annotate around the outside of them. So machines and technology, first one, have been so advanced that basically they have replaced people in quite a lot of the manufacturing and factory-based roles that at one point employed so many people. So a really good example of this in the UK would be seen in car manufacturing specifically. Most of the work now is done via machines, but at one time, each part of the car would have been handmade, and then the construction of them would have taken a whole team of experts to put together. You may not believe this, but at one point in and around the 60s and 70s, Luton was kind of deemed to be one of these up and coming, really quite thriving and aspirational towns within the UK. It was seen as a really, really positive place, a really prosperous place to be. And the main reason for that was because they had 3 huge car manufacturing plants. Paid well. The people that lived there had quite a lot of affluence. They had quite a lot of spare cash. And all of the factories there employed lots of people because every single part of the car was handmade. As the years gone on, however, those people were replaced with machines. And now lots of us have a very different view of Luton, and it certainly isn't known for being the prosperous place that it once was. So that's a really good example that's fairly local to home for you. Second point, as our economy grew in strength, so did the value of the pound. Now, whilst this is a really good thing for the UK and its people, it also means that other countries, however, can provide cheaper alternatives, mainly because their labour, i.e. their workers, are a bit cheaper to pay in comparison to those in the UK. So many of the things that were once manufactured here, we started importing from places like China, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Now, quite often we end up kind of associating that with really poor working conditions. That's not always the case. It's just the fact of the matter is that the pound is stronger. So we have to pay more here for workers than we do perhaps in other countries. So it's just being mindful of that. Third point, a lack of investment basically in this old sector. Mainly because after the sort of turn of the 70s and 80s, lots of the money started being redirected into the tertiary industries. So retail, shopping, finance, new shiny buildings. And unfortunately, that meant that the equipment and machinery that was in all of these factories quickly became quite outdated and couldn't keep up with pace, couldn't adapt very easily, and became really expensive to replace. So again, purchasing the goods from elsewhere was a better option. That elsewhere usually ended up being abroad. So we ended up shifting quite a lot of the stuff that we once were making to now importing from places further afield. It also, believe it or not, proved to be an awful lot cheaper to do it that way than to replace everything. So a huge proportion of our manufacturing industry, we outsourced. And then the final point, just to be aware of, the reason behind deindustrialisation is an awareness of the impact that a lot of these traditional industries were having in our environment, and basically our government trying to commit to reduce the CO2 emissions and create more greener industry. That's really good. In a lot of senses, we've seen a push for a lot of the less kind of old traditional jobs, and you know, lots of money being invested into new, greener, brighter industries. There is a bit of a kind of caveat in there though, which is that has to come from somewhere else. So we've essentially shifted the problem from ourselves into another country, for example, China. Okay, so those are the main reasons then for deindustrialization happening. So I'm hoping that you should be fairly well equipped now to talk around this subject in a little bit more detail, should the need arise. Now, that bit's quite important because all of this kind of pushed forward the changes into the tertiary sector. And it was at this point that standards of living started to rise a little bit. So here's your link between the job sector and the economy and how that impacts on the British people. Something else that has really kind of massively influenced what we do and the cause for a lot of the changes that we experience in our economy is to do with this thing called globalization. Here's another key term alert. Please make sure you know what it is. Globalization is a process, okay? So it's not a thing, it is a process. And it's all about the spread and the growth of ideas and services, goods, and even people, and information around the world. So this can involve the movement of people, and often then with them, they bring things like culture, money, cuisine, finances, and information. It's this whole mix that creates the thing that we know to be globalization. But along with it comes a change and a shift in our economy and also our job structures. This is really important because it relates to why deindustrialisation has occurred so intensely in the UK. This story that I'm telling you about the history of the UK is not necessarily the same for every country. Many people who work now, especially in the tertiary and the quaternary sectors, tend to work for global brands. Okay, and globalisation has been made possible because of developments in things like the transport, the communications, and in a huge sense, the internet. Again, we're going to come back to this as well. Globalisation is one of the main drivers behind that shift into the quaternary sector in particular. So lots of people, as I said, work for those global brands and products, but they don't even have to physically be in the same country. of the brand that they're working for anymore. So for example, if you take things like Microsoft, or you take things like Apple, big tech giants, big tech industries, and you've got people in the UK working for those companies and heading up departments in those companies. They don't live in that country though. And so because of all of that, this has massively changed the way in which the UK economy is working. And it means that people, generally speaking, are actually earning higher wages. It means that we are being exposed to and having access to more advancing technologies. And probably just as importantly, actually, we are also having quite a lot of influence from other economies globally, both in terms of us getting investment, but also us investing in other countries as well. So alongside the growth in the research and IT sectors, however, globalization has also increased things like trade, and that's a big one we're going to come back to. It's enabled more importing and exporting to take place between the UK and other countries, which, as you know, will generate more money. And it also enables us to continue on the trends that we discussed on the previous slides. So, for example, not having to manufacture and put money into those particular things, we can import them instead. But ultimately, this has also led to a huge decline, as we said, in the manufacturing sector. Whilst that's not actually an issue currently, there is a bit of a question, and has been for some time, about what the implication of that will be, though, particularly since Brexit. So, there's an awful lot in the news at the moment concerning that, and concerning how we are going to continue to boost our economy, and what trade is going to look like for us now that we've left the European Union. So it's worthwhile keeping your ear to the ground on that one. The exam board can't ask you directly about those sorts of things, but many of you will have seen the 6 marker that was in paper 2 for your mock. And it did ask about the UK and its links with the wider world, particularly it's sort of insinuated they would like you to talk about trade. So I don't think that question will come up again necessarily, but globalization as a general concept definitely could come up again. So just be mindful of that. I've got another poll question for you, and there we go. Hopefully that has appeared on the screen for you. What do you think NCB stands for? Just going to give you a minute to have a go at answering that one. Okay, and I'll move on whilst you guys are answering that. Okay, so I'm going to be honest. This particular slide is not necessarily the sexy bit of geography, but the government policies play a huge part in determining the successes or failures of a country's economy. We know that. We already talked about that with Nigeria, and we talked about how a corrupt and unstable government led to years of civil wars, and also people not really being willing to trade or converse with them. It took them a long time to get kind of their feet under the table on the global platform. We also know, however, a bit closer to home, that this is true about government policies and their link to the successes or failures of a country's economy, because we literally have lived through and watched the breakdown of our own government last year, I think in and around November 22. Liz Truss, hopefully some of you will recognise that name, she took over from her predecessor, took over the government, but unfortunately failed to gain the confidence of not just her colleagues and council, but also the British public. And this was due to the policies that she was trying to implement. They were all around money, and she failed so much so that she almost completely crashed the UK market, because it wasn't just the government and the British people that didn't believe in the policies she put forward. Unfortunately, it was the rest of the world as well. So people started withdrawing quite a lot of their investments. What that meant basically was that no one felt confident that she was making good decisions about our economy, and they all started pulling out of deals left, right, and centre. That was really, really bad for us. Our pound plummeted in terms of its value, and people put a pause and put a halt on their sort of trading and dealing with the UK. So we already know that this means something, but let's take a bit of a background look at all of this. Starting with 1945. Um, the years that followed on from the Second World War obviously fell within this sort of time frame that we're looking, 45 to 70s. Lots of change in the UK. And during this period, the UK government's priority basically was to ensure that the economy was able to recover, because war is really, really expensive. And so they wanted to quickly boost the economy and make sure that people started being able to have a bit more freedom. So to help with this, they created something called state-run industries. So if I can go back to my poll, I've had 11 responses. Majority of people got them right. Well done. I'm just going to close that now. The answer is that NCB stands for National Coal Board. National Coal Board was one of those state-run industries, but other names that you might be a bit more familiar with are British Rail and also the British Steel Corporation. Government money, i.e. taxpayers' money, so that was quite important, was spent on keeping declining industries afloat for a while during this period too. The issue at that time was that equipment and factories had become outdated already by the 70s, and employment practices had also become outdated. So they weren't fit for that new era of worker. Workers had changes in their education. So people that were leaving school had different skills. They had different qualifications. They had been upskilled. Far more people now were way, way more literate than they ever had been. So working in a factory was far less appealing than it had been. And so this meant that they had to spend more money on wages than they gained in profits, which kind of sent a lot of those companies into spiraling decline. As a result, the later part of this time period, in the late 70s, saw a lot of industrial action being taken. Not too familiar to the way it is now, just very, very different in terms of how it's being conducted. But late 70s, there was a lot of strike action up and down the UK, particularly from the primary sector, but then also with regards to factory workers and plant workers too. This also kind of played out a little bit as social unrest. There was factory closures and also power cuts. All of these were symptomatic of the government policies that had been put in place but were no longer supporting our economy. So this time frame over here is pretty important. It kind of marks a shift and a changing point in the way in which the government had been running the country and the way in which the people were then responding. From the late 70s until in and around 2010, so we're on this time frame here now. Oops, can't draw on a straight line clearly. So from that sort of time frame, many of those state-run industries by this point had then been sold off to private stakeholders, and that was in order to create a slightly more competitive business environment. This was really needed because without this idea of competition, economic growth kind of stagnates. I think we've talked about this before. I'm fairly certain that I mentioned it when we last looked at London, but definitely when we looked at Nigeria. And this idea that if you only have one company providing one of something, they've got no incentive to think about their costings. So they'll put what they want on the table. If, however, you've got two or three companies doing something similar, well, then there's a bit of competition to get custom. So one by one, they will start trying to kind of bring their costs down a little bit, because the chances are they'll get more people buying into it, therefore larger profits. So that was really, really important, and that particular time frame was important for the UK because it really sort of kick-started that economic growth again. Now, that whole process is called privatisation. Whilst all of this may sound like a good thing, and for many people, they believe it really was a good thing, It did mean that lots of traditional industries were then closed down, and with them, so many jobs were lost. Now, this bit becomes really important. Okay, we're going to come back to this much later on in this case study, but this disparity between areas where traditional industries had shut down and areas that kind of adapted, enhanced, is in part of the reason why the UK is in the state it is today. The main issue for a lot of these types of industries was that they had helped to grow whole communities around them. And within those areas, several generations from each family, perhaps even, were employed within those companies. So when they shut down, instead of just one or two people being out of work, most of the community and several generations within that community would then be without employment. So this was a massive problem, obviously. But alongside that, people struggled to retrain because it was all that they had ever known. And as a result, that left huge pockets of unemployment and impoverished communities up and down the UK, particularly as new technologies and new types of industry didn't go in to fill those gaps. However, the policies during this time frame were to support new industries. Okay, so that is the bonus. So whilst on one hand we do have quite a lot of kind of negative stuff going on the other, there was a lot of reinvestment into these new tertiary sector jobs. Many new private companies, however, brought lots of innovation and change. So in a sense, this was a new kind of revolution of sorts. And our whole industry had shifted again. The once derelict old industrial buildings started to be repurposed and transformed into gleaming new office blocks, finance centres, modern retail outlets, luxury apartments, and all of this started to attract new investment, not just within the UK, but also from abroad. Ta-da! So, happy days. Since 2010 then, so we're on this time frame now, the policies introduced from this point on have mainly been to try and rebalance the economy, something we've continued to hear an awful lot of, I might add, since COVID and Brexit. Today, we kind of hear that phrase as levelling up. This is what the government are trying to do, rebalance the economy. The policies that have been introduced from 2010 onwards were done so to rebuild the manufacturing sector and rely less on the service sector industries. They suddenly realised that if you put everything and all your eggs into one basket, that leaves you a little bit vulnerable. Now, particularly when we're talking about Brexit and this shift away from that trading partner that we had previously, it would be quite foolish not to be able to stand on our own 2 feet. So from 2010, an awful lot of the investment on the government side of things did actually go into kind of reintroducing this manufacturing sector and creating jobs within that sector. This has included things other than just factory work, things like improvements to infrastructure. So for example, the HS2 project. Controversial, yes, was on the news again this evening. However, created lots and lots of jobs up and down the country. Crossrail, another great example. We'll come back to that one later. And so because of all of this, there have been lots and lots and lots of incentives for smaller businesses, loans and finance deals for them, a real drive to try and attract foreign investment and encouragement for global firms to relocate within the UK. So since 2010, it's not that they've done a 360, they've not gone all the way back, but they've tried to look for better ways to rebalance the economy there. Okay, so I mentioned this term a little while ago. Please make sure you understand what it means. I just have this feeling that something around this is going to come up. A post-industrial economy. This is where manufacturing industry declines to be replaced with growth in the service sector. So deindustrialization is that breakdown of the manufacturing sector, but a post-industrial economy is what comes after that. So it's the growth in the service sector, basically. And this began happening in the UK from the late 70s, as we know. But by 2015, an enormous 78% of jobs in the UK were recorded as being within this sector. And 10% of jobs now are in the quaternary sector. So that means that wages and the general economy have risen to reflect that slightly more skilled work structure. And along with it, higher standards of living. So that's good. Much of this growth in the post-industrial economy is down to the development and burst of the IT sector. Information technology has literally transformed the way that people are living and working. You already know this, but I think maybe perhaps you don't necessarily appreciate it in the same way. So I picked just a few of the ways in which it kind of has helped and the reasons behind it. But there is an awful lot more detail on page 236 of the textbook. So if you do want to go and kind of read around this a little bit more detail, please feel free. So computers, okay, yes, they did actually really look like that. They are really important because with the dawn of them becoming slightly more domestic, i.e. it wasn't just rich people or massive companies that had them, this meant that large amounts of data was able to be stored, so things could be accessed a lot quicker than all of the big paper copies that they used to have. And this just sped up life generally. It created a larger capacity within workplaces for more to be done, more to be created, things to be sold, analysis of data. It just made things quicker and more efficient. The dawn of the internet, don't laugh, but this one has happened within my lifetime. Dial-up internet only hit the domestic market in the early to mid 1990s. However, the pace at which this has now become the norm has been phenomenal, and its occurrence has meant that information, communication, and money can travel faster than it ever has done before. So what that means is more profits for business. If you can do business that quick and you're not having to send literally pigeons with your information anymore, that allows an awful lot more to take place. What is important, however, is that these changes have impacted and affected the UK economy. Remember, this is the point of this question. So internet access is fairly important, as you would think, because people can move away from being confined to an office. Now, this started before COVID. People did begin working from home because access to computers and internet, good internet, reliable internet, being, available out with workplaces, was really, really important. This kind of lengthened the hours of people working. So rather than people having like a 2-hour commute, for example, that time was spent working instead. So that made the workforce potentially more productive, and therefore, again, for the companies, more profit was gained. Now, this was made so much more obvious since COVID, and lots of workplaces now are trialing kind of even newer methods of remote or hybrid working in a wider range of employment sectors than they were previously. So, even as recently as the last couple of years, this has already changed and taken on a new shape as well. Many new businesses and investments now directly involve IT in some way, the manufacturing of the hardware, the designing of the software, and as a result, over 1.3 million people in the UK now work in this one sector alone, so just within IT. Now, all of this matters when it comes to the UK and the wider world, because it's one of the world's leading digital economies. Okay, so that means that it attracts a lot of investment and businesses from abroad, particularly in things like finance, so e-commerce and research. And this makes us important. It makes us influential to the global markets, and it keeps us really relevant, meaning that our economy remains strong. Therefore, the pound remains strong. And that's good for us in terms of our country's ability to develop. Okay, so that's how we link all of that back to development. So this is just a really quick named example. I'm aware of time. I don't want to spend too much longer on this one. This would be really, really handy if you're asked a question to do with the changes resulting from a post-industrial economy, just as a named example, and allowing you to assess the extent of or needing to make a judgment on the impacts. This particular named example, the British Antarctic Survey, is a really positive example, not only how the UK has shifted mainly into sort of a research-based quaternary type job sector, but also to highlight the significance of this on a global level as well, because they obviously don't just operate within the UK. It is linked to the University of Cambridge, so it's not far from us, and that bit's important because Cambridge University is highly regarded around the world. It recruits PhD students from all over the world, and they use their expertise in the relevant fields to support their scientific research missions that they carry out. But they carry out those missions within the Arctic and Antarctica. Therefore, it is a global platform, and scientists from around the world use that research in order to understand more around the Earth in general, and how what we're doing impacts on the natural systems. So remember that we learned about that in paper 1. We looked at climate change and how particularly these cold environments held the key to understanding what the planet was going through and potentially finding solutions and resolutions. So this named example is a really, really positive one of new job sectors that are kind of taking prominence in the UK currently. So with this shift into post-industrial economy and a growth into tertiary and quaternary sectors, this meant the way in which our employment looked also changed as well. Gone are the days with mining communities, large inner city warehouses, and reliance on urban environments to be productive. What we have here is introducing the era of the science and business parks. So we are going to start with science parks. And you probably already have lots of information on these. We looked at 2 in particular. So this is when I mentioned about having named examples, this is another really good place where you might want to just learn the names of these. Lots of science parks in and around Bedford, actually. So if you've ever driven over towards kind of Sharnbrook area, there's at least 2 over there. What is it though? Well, essentially it's a collection or a group of scientific and technical knowledge based businesses, and they tend to be located on a single site. Quite often they're in a sort of compound like area, so you can see there that that is quite clearly within one area with the main kind of road running through it. There is normally some level of security, and they often have kind of modern looking buildings. But the bit that you will notice here is that there's quite a lot of green spaces, and they tend to be more remote locations out with the main city areas. That bit's quite important because this kind of shows the change and the shift in our thinking towards jobs and the impact that it has on our ability to develop in lots of areas rather than just within our economy. There are well over 100 science parks in the UK. Okay, and most of these have an association with at least one university. This enables their students to access the facilities and the businesses within there to benefit from that new skilled graduate talent, who tend to have kind of more up-to-date knowledge, and that's always advancing within their field. So they have professors that are encouraging them to kind of branch out into new fields. So you might need a named example for this one. And if you remember correctly, the named example, it would help if I put that up first. The named example is Southampton Science Park. So just make a note of that. Okay, thinking about some of the benefits, I am just going to put the rest of this up because I think I've messed this one up slightly. There we go. Okay. Okay, so some of the benefits for companies who base themselves in these science parks. So why would you do it basically? The first reason is there is usually a long and continuous stream of new talent coming from well-maintained links with the university, and they in return get use of really modern research facilities. That bit's important. If you can't guarantee longevity in your workforce, there's very little point in investing quite so much money. So by affiliating themselves with universities, they can pretty much guarantee themselves a stream of current, enthusiastic and well-educated workforce. Second reason, this is quite an attractive location. If you think back to kind of the pictures that we've seen previously on kind of coal mining sites and quarrying sites, this is attractive. It's well maintained, and it's got really extensive green areas in and around it, and around the outskirts of it. So that doesn't just benefit the employees, but it also benefits the local environment too. It's far better than those urban environments that we looked at in the first section. Within this area, you can't see it in this picture, but there tends to be a whole host of things like meeting rooms, cafes, there's super high-speed broadband, there's an on-site nursery, health clubs. All of this is within Southampton Science Park, but it's not exclusive to just this area. So the one that I mentioned over in Sharnbrook's got exactly the same thing in it. This makes it a lot easier for employees and encourages kind of more healthy lifestyles. And this matters because it equates to a happier and healthier workforce, who can more easily balance like family life with their work. That potentially then results in fewer absentees and sick leave. So when you start looking after the employees, when you create this better environment with lots of accessibility to all of these services, generally speaking, you end up with a more productive workforce. So in terms of profit, coming back to the UK economy, that's a really, really positive thing. And then the second type of business that you need to be aware of in a post-industrial economy are business parks. Business parks are just ever so slightly different in the way that they are defined. This is usually an area of land that's occupied by a cluster of businesses. Sometimes that land is privately owned, and the buildings are rented out. Sometimes the land itself can be rented out depending on what the business needs to use it for. Okay. They tend to be situated just right on the edge of towns, and this is for a few reasons, but this does make it slightly different from the science parks. I've got some of the benefits down the side there for you. I'm just going to talk through them just now. So some of the reasons why they are situated on the edge of towns is because the land tends to be a lot cheaper there than inside the towns themselves. We looked at that in question 1. And additionally, there's usually more of it available. So that means that if a company chooses to expand, then that's going to be way more possible than perhaps if they had a similar site in the middle of a city. They're kind of confined by that point. And that's a really good selling point for companies, particularly if you can, I don't know if you can see some of the names on there, but for example, there's Siemens and there's P&G and HP. They're all pretty big companies, and they have potential to need to expand you know, the buildings that they've got. Second reason why they tend to be situated right on the edges of towns is because that's better for getting workers to them. So these ones don't have affiliations with universities, and they need to be able to make sure that their workers can get to them. They tend to also produce things, so being on major transport routes is really important. They are just slightly out of the central areas, but close enough to the main routes that it works for them. So that usually means that there's slightly less traffic and congestion. We have one in Biggleswade. So if you, instead of turning right, if you're leaving Biggleswade to go into the retail park, if you were to go left where Mackie D's is, into that particular area, that is a business park. So if you were to walk around there or drive around there, you would see lots of different business names, and all of that fits what I've just said. Okay, it's right on the A1. It's got direct links both to London, but also all the way up north. It's got huge storage facilities, and actually the businesses can help one another as well. So the edge of towns is quite important for this location. Again, a named example would prove really useful to you if you happen to get asked a question about post-industrial types of work in the UK. And this could come up as a 6 or a 9 marker potentially. So the named example for this one is Cobalt Business Park. This is the one that you want to use here, Cobalt. It's the largest business park in the UK, and it's situated in Newcastle upon Tyne, which is northeast of England, just off of the A1. The access here is really, really important. Like I said, if you think about it, it stretches from London all the way up to Edinburgh. Additionally, it encompasses several support facilities within its park. So just like the science park, it's got things like retail outlets, recreational opportunities like gyms, there's cycleways, there's green spaces. This particular example of Cobalt is really important because this area of the UK, Newcastle, suffered really badly from industrial decline when those traditional businesses began to close down. But businesses that opted for this location received government assistance, so therefore they stood a much better chance of being successful as a result of it. So when you combine the location with the fact that they got government assistance to be in that location, along with the fact that businesses kind of help to stimulate growth of other businesses, so they can pass on clients, they can share ideas. It kind of lends itself to being quite successful. Okay, so some of the names inside that business park, if you want to write them down, are things like Siemens, I mentioned, but there's also Santander and IBM as well. Okay, so just being mindful then of science parks and business parks, how they are different from previous industries, and all of the benefits and thought that goes into these two types of areas. Okay, so these are the sort of replacement for the mining industries and things that we saw before. So why has all of this change occurred and so rapidly? We're all really aware these days of the need to look after our planet. Unfortunately, in order for the UK to have made the advances that we did, it requires a lot of large-scale extraction industries like mining and quarrying, all of which have been really detrimental to the environment, let's face it. Quarries, hopefully you can see that picture there, have been cut into a lot of our countryside areas, and huge waste tips piled up on the edge of the mining settlements, often not cleared up and just left to the elements. The secondary kind of manufacturing industries have had an effect on both the landscape and the environment. We know that. Some of the reasons there I've listed for you. Often they're quite big, they're grey, they're concrete, they're dull, they're a bit of an eyesore. These sorts of industries can cause air, water, and ground pollution, as well as degradation of local soils and things. So farming and things is a bit of an issue. They often produce really large quantities of waste as well, and either this is disposed of at landfill or elsewhere, and that can be really detrimental to both the ground and the water sources. So that sort of kills it off for everyone else. That's where our modern industries have been able to positively impact the environment, for example, though. Okay, so if you're asked a question around changes with regards to or reference to environmental impacts, what you want to really be doing is comparing something like quarrying and mining to things like the business and science parks of this more modern era. The use of technology to kind of reduce the harmful emissions has been hugely successful, and kind of thinking about, it's not that they haven't, or that the UK doesn't have factory plants anymore, but making sure that there is really tight controls over like the chemicals that can be exhumed from there. Additionally, because we're more aware of the impacts, businesses are more likely to be held to account. Whereas before they would have got away with it as long as they were making profit. Now they've got like performance indicators and key targets that they have to stick to, and they're made to be more responsible for their practices and the impacts that they have on the land round about them. So this is a really, really positive move. The environmental impacts have really kind of pushed employers into making good decisions. So as we know, quarrying can have major impacts on our landscape by destroying the natural habitats, the surrounding countryside, polluting the watercourses, and just being really like ugly on what were quite attractive areas. Today, though, there's pretty strict regulations about quarrying. And I mentioned quarrying because one of the named examples in the book for more sustainable industry is Tor Quarry in Somerset. I suggest that you look over this case study. It's on page 241 of the textbook, which remember you can find on Teams. And I would suggest that you just learn a couple of those bullet points and learn this one in a bit more detail. For now, the positives gained from this modern approach to traditional industry mean that the quarry has been restored to create wildlife lakes for recreation. So that's just in and about this bit. There we go. It's also used for things like fishing, for example, as well as water supply. There's lots of more regular monitoring, not just of the kind of pollution and pollutants going into the water, but also for things like noise pollution, for the vibrations being caused by the quarrying, and also airborne emissions like dust. So not necessarily obvious things that you would have thought about. Lots of people think about the groundwater, or they think about the clearance of the land, and the impact it has on the ecosystems. But monitoring things like noise pollution is really important because that can really negatively affect local wildlife, but also residents. The vibrations potentially could have knock-on impacts, and cause kind of mini earthquakes or mini movements within the land. And obviously airborne emissions like dust. Dust is something that we want to avoid. It's not good for respiratory reasons, but also helps to enhance things like climate change. So we want to pull all of that down. One of the other major changes as well that I just want to point out is that they've made a shift, and when they are transporting their raw materials, instead of using like trucks on the roads, they've went back the way, I suppose, in some senses, to using rail as their main method of transport. And that means that there is a reduction in the carbon footprints from this quarry overall. So Tor Quarry is a really good example to kind of spend a bit of time looking at and get your teeth into a little bit. There's lots of lovely examples of how traditional industries can be modernised and can still continue. Again, I just want to point out there's loads of quarries in and around where we live. And so, you know, this is worthwhile considering about the fact that we don't live in a poor area. We live in quite an affluent part of the country. And yet we have a lot of these things that I'm talking about. And there must be a reason why it's working. Okay. I'm just very aware of time. So what I might need to do is do this bit and then call call time because we've still got transport to get through as well. Okay, I'll finish this bit and then we'll finish up for tonight. What I might do is record that last little section on transport and post that for you rather than keeping you too much later. I do appreciate that you have lasted as long as you have. Okay, so just very quickly then. Changing rural landscapes. This is a big one, and this tripped quite a few people up in the mock. Whenever I was marking it, I was aware that people just hadn't quite paid attention to the fact that the focus here is on the rural landscapes and not the urban. Don't forget that the UK is really diverse. It's made up of both urban areas, but it's also made up of rural areas too, and they also contribute to the economy and also need a bit developing. One aspect of this case study, the UK, that's come up recently and could well come up again, is that of how rural landscapes have changed in the UK and how they affect the economy. So to look at this, if you remember, we split this into rural areas of population growth, and the case study was, or the named example, sorry, was South Cambridgeshire, and population decline, and we looked at the Outer Hebrides. So let's begin with this one. Let's begin with an example that's quite close to home, so it should be a wee bit easier for you to remember. South Cambridgeshire is a really good example of an area of rural area of population growth. As we know, because if you just look outside, you would see that it is a mainly rural area, meaning that it's not a town or a city. It's got fewer built up areas, particularly that south area of Cambridgeshire. Just if I can point out on the map, all of this is Cambridge, but that bit there is South Cambridgeshire. Okay. The population has been relatively small in comparison to, say, the city of Cambridge itself, but it has begun to grow, sorry, in recent years. Mainly down to migrants moving into that area. And when I say migrants, I don't necessarily just mean international migrants. I'm talking about people perhaps from Cambridge City itself and other parts of the UK that have moved into this particular area. But it did begin to extend to international migrants too in and around 2015. And as you would expect, all of this comes with some impacts and effects. Some of the social and economic effects of this growth. This is the bit that people really didn't articulate very well when they were writing about this in the mock. So I would definitely recommend just kind of re-looking over this. Just because it came up in the mock doesn't mean it couldn't come up again. So some of the effects then, believe it or not, population growth isn't always a really positive thing. You'll notice a lot of these actually are not positive effects. So commuters continue to use the services in the places where they work and rather than where they live. And this can have a really negative impact on the local rural economy. So people will move, for example, out to the countryside because it's a nicer pace of life. And they like living there and they can get a house with more space, but then perhaps maybe work in Cambridge City itself or even London City itself. The problem is, though, that they actually probably spend more of their time during the week anyway in those cities, and so they'll continue to spend their money in those cities rather than in the local area. So not a lot of local economy actually tends to happen in those areas, and this is true of South Cambridgeshire. Because it's a bit more rural, most people usually end up owning a car. So car ownership is really, really high. In fact, in this particular area, it's over 80%. So over 80% of people have at least one car. And this has a really profound effect on not just the environment, but remember that we're talking about rural Cambridgeshire. And if you've ever been around there, you'll notice that the roads are really, really narrow. They're not really built for lots and lots of people trundling up and down in massive cars. So unfortunately, that starts to degrade the quality of the roads a little bit, but it also reduces the demand for public transport services, which ultimately ends up being cut out. So we end up losing money in other areas. Another problem is that with such a transient population, because they're commuters, a rapid modern development tends to happen there, but you end up with quite a lack of community spirit. So in South Cambridgeshire, there's a lot of new builds, lots of lovely houses, but not really the same sort of community spirit that you might find in maybe perhaps the older parts of Cambridge. And that can cause a bit of a problem. We come across this term gentrification again. Now, we learned about that in question 1, section A, when we did our urbanisation. So I won't go over that again, but it's just to say that young people in this area that grew up in this area then can't afford the new housing. They get priced out. So they get forced out of that area completely. and that causes a bit of a problem. And because of the demand, because of the high car ownership, this particular area of the UK, although it's rural, actually has some of the highest pricing in the country, particularly for things like petrol. And that's because of the high demand, but actually extends to all of the general living costs. So as you can see, despite the fact that we've got population growth, in a rural setting, this can be quite negative. By contrast, and I promise I'll finish up after this bit, the Outer Hebrides, completely different end of the scale. Perhaps this can provide a better picture. The Outer Hebrides is a collection of 65 small Scottish islands. It's got a really small population, has done for a long time. The majority of people live on the main island, which is the island of Lewis. Despite a really small growth in recent years, mainly because of retirees moving there because it's so pretty, the overall population has been in decline. So much so that since 1901, the number of people living there has actually halved. This decline is mainly due to onward migration, people simply moving away from the area. Limited work opportunities mean that younger people with new skills can't find the employment and the things that they enjoy, and they choose to leave because of better paid employment in more modern industries elsewhere, usually on the mainland, in places like Glasgow and Edinburgh, or even down as far as London. So as you can see on there, there's quite a few social and economic effects, but they are different from areas of population growth. In a population decline area, one of the biggest things is the lack of services that end up being available. Because of the fewer numbers of children that are available to attend school, we end up with that particular service not getting used. And as a result, lots and lots and lots of school closures have taken place all across the Outer Hebrides. Now that is a problem, but it makes it even harder for new families to want to move into the area, because any new family moving in with children, that's just potentially going to put them off. It's one of the first things you look at when you move into an area if you've got children. The movement of young people away from that area also then means a huge reduction in the workforce just generally. So that's not an attractive prospect for the businesses that might be thinking of moving into that area. If you don't have a workforce, you're going to really, really struggle. And along a similar thread, happens to have quite an aging population. So whilst that can bring in money, it tends to mean that there's more of a strain on things like healthcare and social services, because older people tend to require more than younger people do. Now, the government has provided subsidies to the Outer Hebrides towards the cost of various things. For example, operating a ferry from the islands to the mainland, and making sure that essential healthcare services are there. So the government has tried to boost that population, but it is a real struggle to keep those services afloat, because things like the post office just don't have the money, and they can't stay open. However, one of the real positive changes in this particular area has been an increase in the number of tourists to the area. It doesn't just provide employment, but it boosts the local economy. Again, we've talked about that in various other areas before. So just bearing in mind the differences between population areas of decline and population areas of growth, neither are particularly positive. But do be able to talk around it and just consider the pros and cons to both of these. Right, ladies and gents, I'm so sorry I've kept you 8 minutes over. I knew I wasn't going to be able to keep to the time. I did not meet my own target. What I'm going to do is pre-record the last little section, which is all about transport. This comes up an awful lot. And I wouldn't be surprised if a 6 or a 9 marker were to come up in this context. So I will pre-record that bit and I will load that particular bit up for you, so that you're not missing out on that. As always, if you've got any questions, please feel free to drop me a line. More than happy to answer any questions that you've got. This is the last of the human Twilight sessions that I'm going to be running. The next few are on physical case studies. So if you've got any questions about anything else that I haven't covered yet, please feel free again just to drop in and ask me at a drop-in session. Thank you so much for listening, folks. Well done tonight. Enjoy the rest, or what's left of your evening. See you later.